Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Orsid's 2023 budget webinar. I believe that I know many of the attendees of this webinar tonight, and so welcome. And for those of you that I've not had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Andre Kaplan. I'm the Chief Financial Officer at Orsid, New York. I have been managing budgets and finances in the real estate industry for over 30 years, and at Orsid for well over 20 years. I hope that you find this budget webinar insightful and beneficial. And so thank you for attending and spending the time with us tonight. A few introductions and some thank yous. I would firstly like to introduce the team behind the scene that make all the financial assistance and reporting and budget preparation happen. So I would like to welcome and who are with us behind the scenes tonight, and the team: Joe, Ben, Sal, Jay, Rob, Ada, another Andre, and Aya. So that's the team behind the scenes. And also I would special shout out and a big thank you to Ben Hawkins, who his particular involvement and assisting us in assembling this webinar tonight. So Ben, thank you for your help. This presentation will be recorded, and all the attendees will automatically receive a copy in a day or two after this webinar. So any notes or whatever, you'll be welcome to refer to in the email that you will receive. This will also be going out to all board members for information purposes. So moving into the actual webinar, and many of you have seen this pie chart before, and just as a recap, in terms of what makes up the budget, what makes up the maintenance or the common charges that you pay and your community pays every single month. So in terms of looking at the big pieces of the pie, real estate taxes, 51% on average, payroll, 27%, utilities, 7%, your mortgage, which is your financial obligation, 6%, insurance, which is now 5%. And we're going to talk a little bit about the impact of the insurance industry in this webinar tonight. But I must tell you that compared to prior years, this percentage is creeping up. It used to be between 3 and 4%, now makes up 5% of your total expenditure. And repair, supplies, and other is at 4%. So in terms of controllable expenses, which we always talk about, if you take your taxes and your payroll and utilities, it's well over 80%. You add your financial obligation, which generally most buildings are locked into a 10-year mortgage, and your insurance and professional fees at 5%, 96% of your budget we have very little control over, sadly. In terms of a condominium, a slightly different makeup, because the real estate taxes are paid by unit owners directly. However, the impact is the same. It's a function of what makes up the carrying costs of your apartment. And so you can see in terms of a condominium, 61% is payroll, and the rest of the percentages as detailed on the slide. So that's just as a recap. So let's go into the biggest piece of the pie, which are the taxes. And the taxes, the real estate taxes, are made up of two components. The first is the tax rate, which is assigned by the city council. And two is the assessed value, or the transitional assessed value. Now, the assessed value is not the market value. It is not what your apartment is worth. This value is established as if you were a rental building, and it's a free market, and it's based on free market rents on a per square foot basis. Now, For this reason, and I'm going to refer to it a little bit later because it comes under compliance, which we're going to talk about, but the square footage of your building can be an extremely important component to real estate taxes, and what the city data base has in terms of your square footage of your building to what it actually is. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in more detail later on in this webinar. So those assessed values are on a rolling average, on a 5-year rolling average, and the tax abatement, which is offset for co-ops and condominium, which is approximately 17.5%, flows through against this assessed value, and then against your tax bill. That abatement, the co-op and condo tax abatement program, has been renewed and is in place until the spring of 2027. So that is good news for all buildings and all owners in general. So as I said, the square footage we're going to talk about in terms of compliance with Local Law 84 and 97, which I will be explaining to you later on in this webinar. Going on in terms of, so now we spoke about the two components, the tax rate and the assessed value. I'm going to talk about the assessed value first. So firstly, what did we assume in 2023 for the budgets? What we assumed was a 5% increase over the assessed value pre-pandemic. So, and we're going to talk about where you can see the chart on the right-hand side of your screen, where you can see the 2020-21 with a $23 million value, and you can see that 11% reduction in 21-22. That was what we refer to as a tax holiday, which was across the board reduction in the assessed value that was given to most buildings in the city. And so what we assumed when we've been doing the budgets is that that assessed value would return to pre-pandemic values going forward with a 5% increase. Due to a delay, fortunately, in data flowing through to the Department of Finance, the buildings enjoyed, and were fortunate, I'm not sure if enjoyed is the word, but fortunate that those assessed values did not increase substantially as a result of delayed data. A lot of the data that is still with the Department of Finance is coming out of the pandemic and is not reflecting the increased values in terms of the rental market, which is continuing to strengthen. And this will drive the assessed values up going forward. So we do grieve all the open years, as we've spoken about, and we do a mid-year budget review. So those assessed values come out generally in June before the July tax bills. So what we always do, Orsid as a management company, we look at what the assessed value, how it compares to what we actually budgeted. And if there is a large variance, we would notify those boards directly. We were very we're happy to inform you that when we did the review this year, there were very, very few negative variances where there were some big adjustments. There is always a rolling average. So if we focus now on the chart on the right-hand side, let's look at a little bit of what happened. It works on a 5-year rolling average. So we've highlighted that in yellow. And you can see that we got a tax holiday of the 11%. Then this is the trend that we are seeing. Then we saw a 5% increase over the lowered assessed value, which was good news. And then some lower adjustments or relatively flat in 2023 actuals, which is the 2023-24 tax year. So just as a reminder, the Department of Finance in the cities runs a fiscal year from July 1 to June 30th. Most of the buildings are on a calendar year, January to December. So we're dealing with one half of a tax year for one half of the city's financial year and another in the second half. So going forward, what do we expect and what are we going to see? Because of the increased rental market, the city needs funding. So what we're seeing is, and what we are going to assume, what we have learned is that those values, those assessed values, they now are going to go back as the data flows through, more up-to-date data flows through, back to the 2020-21 values, which is pre-pandemic values, and assume a 5% increase on that. So you can see that you're going to see a big jump in assessed values going up approximately, could be 17% compared to the lower value from the reduction. However, it's a 5-year phase-in. So if you look on the far right-hand side, the net impact, you're going to see between a 5% and a 6% actual increase in assessed values as those phase in. As the lower years in terms of the assessed values drop off and the higher values phase in, so the assessed value will continue to increase. So whether you've had a relatively small assessed value increase or a large assessed value increase, unfortunately, the reality is your taxes are going to go up, number one. Number two is that phase in is going to, fortunately, the bulk of it you're going to see in future years. You will see a big bump in 2024, but the full effects of the adjusted assessed values you're really going to see in 2025. Let's go on to the tax rate, which is the second component on how the taxes are calculated. So the rate, as you can see from the history on the right-hand side, really has not been increased. The last increase was 2011, 2012. It was proposed that a 5% increase in the tax rate would happen this year. Fortunately, and it's just been confirmed, that there's actually only going to be a 2% increase. So we're going to have a double impact in terms of adjustment in assessed values, being the lag is over in terms of data flowing through to the city, a buoyant rental market in residential, and an increase in the tax rate of 2% that we haven't seen in over 10 years. So those are the factors that we are going to be dealing with regards to taxes. Just bear in mind that almost 60% of the revenue that the city relies on comes from real estate taxes, and the city has to run, the city has to be funded, and therefore this is going to impact us. As you can see, they're starting to make adjustments to balance their budget. In terms of, we spoke about the city's fiscal year and the increase in the tax rate. So how are we going to deal with that? Because that increase in the tax rate that has been published of 2% is going to be retroactive to July of 23. So the second half of this year. And that is going to be billed in 2024. So we're going to address that in your 2024 budgets. To prepare cash flow wise, most of the buildings today self-escrow for real estate taxes, and therefore we have already, just from a cash flow point of view, adjusted your tax escrow, that we make sure that we meet, from a cash flow point of view, your tax obligation for January. So I want to assure you that that is going to be addressed. And so going forward, we're going to move on in terms of the next piece of the pie, and that is going to be payroll. Okay. So as you can see, just as a history, in terms of union buildings that, so basically most of the buildings are governed by the collective bargaining agreement between 32BJ and the Realty Advisory Board. Last year in 2022, the union contract was renewed through April of 2026. All-in costs, as shown on the slide, is $111,000 per person. On average, which is in line with historical trends, an all-in cost increase is between 4% and 4.5%. And just interesting in terms of the history on the right-hand side, you can see 10 years ago, the average cost of $76,000. At the end of the contract, it's going to be $121,000 when it renews in April of 2026. And the increase from 10 years ago to today is almost 46% increase, mainly driven by healthcare costs in terms of benefits. So just to put that in perspective. Other areas where we need to remain focused on is how we manage summer relief, that we don't run overtime, and that we try and use temps and relief workers, that we try and manage our overtime in buildings as best as possible, and then to be mindful of union benefit obligations. So if you have a part-timer that is working more than 2 shifts a week consistently, they could be and will be eligible for union benefits, which will add a substantial cost to your budget. So just be mindful. We do monitor this, but please just be mindful. I know sometimes it's tough to find temps and relief workers, but we need to be careful of what the impact could be for your building. The last area, which I'm not going to spend particularly a lot of time on tonight, but that is the prevailing wage. And we have addressed this in prior years, and we believe that most of the buildings have completed this analysis and decided of how they wish to proceed. We are keeping a watchful eye on any building that is getting close to the impact of the prevailing wage. For those of you that are new board members or new to Orsid, the prevailing wage is based on a assessed value per unit. So if the value on a per unit basis is at a certain level, and this relates to maintaining the condo tax abatement, which is the 17.5% relief that you get from the real estate taxes. And this really applies to anyone doing work in the building that falls under the tasks that is typical of building staff to be compensated at a level equal to a 32BJ employee. So, for example, if you are a union building, however, you use a security guard service for your building, and your assessed value per unit is at a certain level, your building might be subject to the prevailing wage. But we have addressed all those buildings that this applies to. We're going to move on. We have a big agenda tonight. The next piece, and has been the biggest impact and will be a large impact on the 2024 budget, and this is the challenges and insurance. So overall increases as high as 150%. I think most of you have seen this and addressed and discussed this. Umbrella coverage completely has been restructured. The trends which has been driving the insurance market, which we have been spoken about for many years, which is the labor law claims, litigation costs, large jury verdicts, social justice claims, cybersecurity claims, climate change, wildfires, hurricanes. So while the insurance market remains challenged and unstable, recent weather events will certainly further challenge the already tight market and will continue to increase the cost of claims. given the measures that we took last year to stabilize programs, we are more optimistic going forward. However, there's still a great deal of uncertainty and volatility, especially in the umbrella markets. And so we have to continue to budget conservatively. We anticipate that the umbrella markets will eventually stabilize as more programs are established. However, it will not be at the favorable pricing levels we have experienced historically, and capacity will continue to be limited for the foreseeable future. So, unfortunately, we are going to have to continue to be conservative. We are going to assume a 10% increase over the 2023 numbers in 24, based on what transpired in 2023. What are we doing? Some of the items that we are looking to do to help this is we have partnered with BCS, which is Business Credentialing Services, to help minimize the risk of labor law claims against buildings by contractors hurt on site. This is really, really, really important. Once fully up and running, BCS will act as a gatekeeper to ensure that vendors working in your buildings have evidence of insurance and indemnifications. Our goal is to have this service completely operational by the beginning of 2024 at no additional cost to the buildings. Moving on to the next piece, which is mortgages. So looking back to 2021, and the budget rate for a 10-year loan is up from 3% to today. If you went for a regular mortgage in the marketplace, the rate today would be 7%. If you look at the graph on the right-hand side, and we look back over 30 years, you can see that the average rate is actually 8%. So we're still slightly below the average. I know for the last 20 years, we've enjoyed a declining interest rate market. And so, many of us are not used to seeing the 7% number, and the 3 to the 4% mark is what we have seen historically. Unfortunately, the landscape today is completely different. The lenders have also, many of them have disappeared from the market. So there not is a wide range of lenders as there was in the past. Credit lines have become more expensive. So if you had to draw on your credit line today or in the future, the average rate you could be looking at is close to 10%. So in terms of condominiums, there are loan products available, but please be mindful that before even embarking on this, owner consent is absolutely key, is a key requirement in condominiums. So when we get to capital planning and capital funding, we are going to have to start looking at alternatives, long-term assessments, transfer fees, trying to keep up with the market. In terms of second mortgages and additional lines of credit, they are not easily obtained and not readily available. Many of the banks that hold your current mortgages are not offering second mortgages at this time, and they're trying to force your hand if you do need further funding to refinance, because they're locked in at 3%, and obviously they would like to refinance the mortgage at current ratings today. So lending, while there's always, you will always be able to borrow and obtain a mortgage, an underlying mortgage. It's just the market is tighter and very different than we've seen in many, many years. And so most of the buildings, if we have managed you since 2021, are locked into really good mortgages for 10-year terms. We're going to talk a little bit about long-term planning, and as we go through that, of what, and we can help you with that and how that models out. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later when we get to capital planning. But bear in mind that to fund capital needs, we're going to have to do some long-term planning in terms of assessments, in terms of financial modeling to meet those needs, with keeping in mind the sensitivity of your communities. We're going to move on to the next section, which is substantial to your budgets, which is utilities. So in 2000, and you can see from these graphs, in 2022 was the most expensive energy years of all time. And we assumed in budgeting for 2023 that this trend would continue. The reality in 2023 was that there was a drop in energy. And this was a good thing, because as we just spoke about the tough insurance market, and you're all aware of how those costs, some of them increased by 150%, we were able to offset some of these savings in energy costs against the impact for 2023 in those big increased insurance premiums. But as we look ahead, basically, so Con Edison has been lobbying for a rate increase, and that has been approved, and that's going to go into effect in 2024. And bearing in mind that you can only lock the supply portion of your gas and electric. And today, that the delivery portion has grown to 70%. So the variable that we can work with in reality is only 30% of the cost of your electric and gas. So we get a lot of questions going through the budget. Should we lock? Is there a hedging option? And so I'm not going to get into the pros and cons in this webinar tonight. However, if you had to go out and hedge the cost of natural gas today, this would cost you approximately 30 to 40% over the spot price today if you had to lock in a rate. For electricity, that would be 100% over the spot price today if you went to lock in a rate. As a result of the increased Con Edison rates that were approved and what we're anticipating in the markets, we believe that a 10% increase is prudent for electric and gas for the 2024 budgets. Oil spiked in 2022 due to the war in the Ukraine, and then came under budget for most in 2023. Again, a good thing. However, with the Middle East making voluntary production cuts through the end of 2023 and recent increases, we believe that we will continue to hold the 2023 budgeted numbers for oil with a small cushion. Again, the question of should we lock for oil? If you had to lock for oil today, a locking would be between, the premium would be between 10 and 20% over the spot price today. And then those buildings that are currently burning number 4 oil will be required to switch to number 2 oil only on the renewal of their tri-annual permit. So that will be from June of 2024 through July of 2027. The cost, if you had to switch today from number 4 to number 2, would be approximately an additional 40 cents per gallon, which on today's pricing would equate to an increase of approximately 11% before you started out. And then over and above that, we would need to assume some sort of cushion for budget in 2024. So that's if you are one of those buildings with a triennial permit and you're burning number 4 today, of what you are going to have to deal with. And we will address that in your 2024 budget with you. Water and sewer, you can see 2023, virtually double the percentage increase that we've seen in prior years. and the same is expected for 2024. And so gas and electric costs are down, as we mentioned, in 23 peak, but higher increases are on the way for 2024. Repairs and maintenance and just general supplies. So we've spoken about the impact of real estate taxes, payroll costs, healthcare costs, insurance, interest rate increases. So that is going to be a direct flow through. And we're all seeing it, just going to the supermarket alone, you can see what things used to cost and what they cost today. So inflation is currently running at approximately 3.2% today, while a year ago it was at 8.6%. And we are going to, especially post-COVID, we're continuing to see the impact of cost of material and services, and not to mention the necessary compliance factor, which is going to impact capital as well, which we're going to talk about, but we spoke about insurance and indemnifications, and that all adds to the cost. So we are going to assume a 5% increase going forward in this category. Let's move on. So now we have to balance our budget. We spoke about the big pieces of the pie, the smaller pieces of the pie, and now how do we balance the budget? So we know that the abatement has been renewed through June of 2027. 98% of the buildings cooperatives assess for that tax abatement to recapture it and forms part of income. And we're going to talk about, when we get to capital, is should we start setting aside a portion of that to start funding our capital plan, revisiting ancillary fees, such as storage, gym fees, and things to help spread the burden, sublet fees, where those make a big impact on buildings, should we be revisiting that, alteration fees, where we can generate revenue for the building, and then for those buildings that have commercial revenue, again, retail market is tough. Try and keep your tenants in place, work out a deal if you can. What you do not want is a vacant space at any cost. So within reason, try and keep your commercial tenants in place. Something to be aware of when lease do renew, and we will help you keep your eye on this, where there is a real estate escalation clause in those commercial leases. When those leases reset, those real estate escalation clauses go back to zero and will make an impact on your revenue. And so we need to be mindful of that long term as well. Other areas how the environment has changed. So we spoke on the mortgage side, how expensive it's become, but most buildings did pull out additional cash. They're locked in at low interest rates and have reserve funds. So the key is, and we are working with all our buildings, is can we continue, and we should generate interest income. How are buildings investing? So generally with a condominium or a co-op, it's low risk, either laddered CDs, laddered treasuries, preferred money market accounts that are government backed. You can see just out of interest, the average rate of return that you can achieve. We're not investment advisors, but definitely here to assist you and guide you in making sure, and we're making every effort to make sure that your funds are invested, earning a good rate of return in a safe and insured environment. Just remember that the FDIC limit is $250,000 per financial institution. And so we want to be mindful of that unless you're in a government-backed money market account or equivalent. So that those items can alleviate maybe a small portion of the burden that you're going to have to address in terms of operating expenses. Now, the most important aspect of your building is the capital planning, and that is going to be the biggest impact. So the operational budget is, as we spoke about, we're going to try hard. We appeal the taxes. We look for ESCOs for energies, only 30%. We're constantly looking to try and improve where we can, but we have very little control, and we will navigate that as best as possible. But the capital planning is your biggest exposure. So most of you have heard this from me before. I'm going to repeat it. 3 main components of your capital planning: compliance, which we're going to talk about upcoming, and the impact of the local laws; the infrastructure needs, which is your elevators, your heating plant, sidewalks, roof, all those need to be maintained and have a reasonable lifespan. And we need to put in place the placeholders going out 1 year, 5 year, and 10 year. Remember, your mortgage will mature at some point. With a volatile interest rate market, we don't know where we're going to land up. So we need to be mindful of all these items. And last but not least is what I refer to as the wish list, which is items affecting value. And that is such as hallways, lobbies, and fitness centers. So just like you're a business and you want to maintain your building, it's your home, you want to maintain value, achieve capital appreciation, and stay competitive with your neighbors. And so we have to keep, it's a juggling act, but we have to keep working at it. So let's start with the compliance factors. And we're going to start with the biggest one, which is the Facade Inspection Safety Program, FISP, formerly known as Local Law 11. So it's a 5-year cycle, and it's based on block number. Cycle 9, which is 2020 to 2024, and 10, 2025 to 2029. So new requirements, 1. So soft costs are becoming more and more expensive. Intensive inspections are driving those costs to 6 figures. Big change, 2022, most of you are aware, third-party site safety inspections are required if your building is more than 14 floors, cost of an additional $50,000 to $60,000. And now, also, annual parapet inspection required starting 2024. So every single year, your parapet is going to need to be inspected. And this is referred to as Local Law 126. Not because I would hate to confuse you any further, but also classified as Local Law 126 if your building has a parking garage. A filing is done every 6 years with timing based on community district. Cycle 1 ranges 2022 to 2027. So that's on the facades and the garage. In terms of, I skipped a slide. So gas piping inspections, Local Law 152. This is for the gas. Filing is done every 4 years with timing based on the community district. And it's a sniff test. It could be very, very expensive. This could be exposure to the building in terms of gas shutdowns. So, we, basically keep an eye on it. Super should have, or resident manager should, have be checking this, and there are outside consultants that can assist you with checking that. The last thing we want is a gas shutdown. Next is, just get to the next slide, is energy requirements. So this is a big topic, and I'm going to discuss it in broad terms for this purpose of this webinar and get into a little bit more detail. So firstly, Local Law 84 benchmarking. So this is the energy data that we have to collate and supply. So beginning 2025, the filing requirement will be building measurements. So what does this mean? Basically, this will be a measurement on a per square foot basis for your entire building. It will also require a breakdown of the use type for each space. We're going to be in touch later on this year in coordinating this process for your building. The cost of this is going to be between $5,000 and $10,000 for each and every building. So this is important. It's an important measurement for the benchmarking standard and as well for the Department of Finance. So now, if you recall where I referenced the real estate taxes and your assessed value is based on a market-related residential rent on a per square foot basis in your neighborhood. And we want to make sure, and this will give us the opportunity that the city's data in terms of the square footage for your building matches the actual size of your building. We have had some cases where we have challenged the city when we do the appeals, and buildings have measured their buildings historically, that the data that the city had was actually incorrect. And they were billing you for more square footage than you actually had. And some of those buildings achieved a massive reduction and a credit in their real estate taxes. I'm not saying that's across the board. We haven't seen it widespread, but this will give us a perfect opportunity while we have to comply with local law 84. This will give us the opportunity with this data to double check the city is billing you the correct real estate taxes. So that's in terms of local law 84. So going on to the Climate Mobilization Act, local law 97. There's been much in the news. There's been much discussion in terms of the limit on greenhouse gas emissions, penalties that are going to begin in 2025 based on 2024 data and 2020 and 2030. So the utility page of every budget that we prepare reflects those pending penalties, if there are penalties. It's $268 per metric ton, and it's probably the most expensive in the world. Now, this is constant. I'm going to say this with a caveat, is that local law 97 is constantly evolving. And what do we have to do now? So one is we need to refer back to our local law 87 audit report. And that audit report is prepared every 10 years. And that report includes base potential carbon reduction projects such as lighting. The engineer for your building will guide you through those reports and advise you where there are rebates. They will also assist the buildings in applying for those rebates. There are rebates, tough to obtain, but there are rebates available from Con Edison, NYSERDA, PACE. They're complicated, and your engineer or energy consultant will be able to help you guide you through them. However, they're generally for much bigger projects. There are some for lighting, and they will be able to advise you, and we'll be able to advise you a little bit more in detail. There's been some recent publications that recent good faith efforts will mitigate penalties under local law 87. We don't believe that this will be feasible in most buildings, as it will, in their current state. And so we believe that those penalties will remain. It's often important, it is important when we look at those penalties and the return on investment on making some of those improvements that could possibly reduce that. Is it worthwhile? Is it achievable? What sort of return are you going to get on your investment? So for example, if your annual penalty is $5,000 per year and the required investment to mitigate that penalty is $2 million, one has to weigh up the impact of that. So we have to be mindful of that analysis. So continuing on, we are going to, I think that brings us to the end of the compliance. What I would like to suggest, because there's such a vast subject matter in terms of Local Law 97, the New York Council of Cooperatives and Condominiums have been offering various seminars on the subject, and you can see that this is detailed here. They're here to help you, and you're welcome to attend. This flyer we will be sending out with the recording, so if anybody would like to register for it, Dennis DiPolo, one of our executive vice presidents, will be speaking on this at the council at one of their seminars. So if you'd like to learn more about this, please feel free to register and attend. So as a recap in terms of operations, understanding the big pieces of the pie, real estate taxes, and functions of assessed values between 5 and 7%, as we spoke about, looking at pre-pandemic levels, payroll in terms fits right into historical trends between 4 and 4.5%, mainly driven by benefits, and then the impact for those buildings with regards to the prevailing wage. Insurance, the adjustment is in 2023. We are going to feel that adjustment really in increases both in common charges and maintenance increases in our 24 budgets. Utilities, macro influences, approximately 10% increases there. Repairs and maintenance and supplies, 5%. And mortgages, we have spoken about. Fortunately, most of you are locked in where you were in a position to refinance when you did. So just to set the stage before we go on to capital, a recap. What we are seeing on average is, and I want to prepare everybody accordingly, is, and a lot of it's driven between real estate taxes and the insurance this year, that maintenance and common charge increases, both, the expectation is 7% plus for 2024. For those buildings that are below the 7% mark, you can count yourself as you're ahead of the curve. But in reality, what we're seeing as we are starting to prepare these budgets is the average is going to be 7% plus, mainly. And don't be completely in despair, because a lot of it, or at least half, is driven by insurance, and it's going to be a one-time adjustment. And so just keep that in mind. Recap in terms of capital checklist, understanding the timing and the compliance, because they're cyclical, and we're going to help you with this. Facade, gas testing, Climate Mobilization Act, this will all be reflected on your budget. And then understanding funding options, investments, so we make sure the money is invested, assessments, trying to keep it smooth, that we can achieve the goals, catering to your community, with looking at forward thinking in terms of when does your mortgage mature, will you be in a position to borrow more money, how are you going to fund all these necessary capital items when you're dealing with an aging building, and compliance matters, transfer fees, and then lending and what options are available to me. So these are all items to consider, and we will be helping you as we go through the budget process. And that brings us to the end of our actual presentation. Those of you that have any questions, Chelsea Shapiro, our moderator for tonight, is going to read us the questions, and I will do my best to answer them. Obviously, we will try and get through as many as we can in our limited time. And so over to you, Chelsea. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andre, for a great presentation. A couple questions. The first one, Is the carbon credit market becoming an option for buildings with respect to the Climate Mobilization Act?
I'm not an expert in this, and I don't think for co-ops and condominiums, it has completely evolved as of yet.
All right. A bit of a longer question. Do boards have options about how to collect assessments, or is that determined by the governing documents? Specifically, could an assessment be determined in total and varying payment approaches permitted, either a discount for upfront payment or charging interest for paying over time?
Good question, and yes. So the board, so let me just clarify this. Everybody has to be offered the same across the board. Every shareholder or unit owner has to be offered the same options. The per share amount or the dollar amount has to be the same across the board. And then, yes, you can determine different payment options, different periods of time, upfront, pay over time, discounts. If you pay over time and not pay upfront, the board does have those options. You should always check with legal counsel. However, I believe that most buildings have that option as long as those options are offered equally and fairly to everybody.
All right. Would you mind repeating what you mentioned about part-timers and union benefits?
Sure. So if you have a part-timer that works more than 2 shifts per week on a consistent basis, and every 3 years your building is, if your building is subject to the collective bargaining agreement with 32 BJ, so your building is subject to a union audit every 3 years. What the union audit will determine is that part-timer, because they work more than 2 shifts per week on a consistent basis, is actually classified as a union employee and therefore is subject to benefits, and therefore the building will have to retro pay those benefits for that part-timer. And so the building will have a huge cost impact for a part-timer that works consistently more than 2 shifts per week consistently.
Thank you, Andre. We have about 2 more questions. What do you see across the Orsid portfolio that insurance represents as a percentage of the overall budget?
Around 5%.
Great.
And obviously that has increased substantially from prior years.
Okay. Will corrections to increase square footage that help energy calculation potentially create increases in real estate taxes?
No, we are hoping that it will be the other way around, but no. This will purely be, we believe that will just be related to energy and not real estate taxes.
Okay. A bunch have come in. We're gonna answer just a few more for sake of time. Okay, in terms of capital planning, is it advisable to work out a plan that outlines the useful life of major mechanical systems and building structures such as windows and roof?
So I don't, a professional study is not necessarily the right or an approach that might not be necessary. They're expensive, and they become less relevant, and you've invested all this money. But placeholders for roofs and windows is always a good thing, depending where your building is at. And to put a placeholder there. There might be other priorities, obviously, but always a good placeholder.
Thank you, Andre. What will the annual parapet inspections involve?
So they will basically be able to be done generally from the roof. And so they will do drops and visual inspections. They will not have to put up bridges or anything of that nature.
Great. We have one more that we will answer. Do local law 84 benchmarking and local law 97 apply to energy usage by individual units or just usage in common spaces?
And its usage in terms of common spaces, they look at the building as a whole, not individually.
All right. One more quick one on parapets. Is it really necessary to inspect the parapet every year? How much would that add to the budget?
So it is a requirement, as it's a local law 126. I don't know of exactly the cost implications of what that will entail at this time.
All right. Any other questions that we've received are a bit more specific to buildings, so we will cover those offline with you directly. But we want to thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you, Andre, for a very thorough presentation. We appreciate it, and I know everyone else does too.
Yeah. Thank you. And just before we say good night, as I said, everybody is going to receive a copy of this recording. Please feel free. You can email me if we didn't get to your questions tonight. We're all available to answer those questions. And when that email goes out, we would really much appreciate I hope you enjoyed this webinar tonight. We're in the service industry, and so we would appreciate if anybody would take the time and do a review on a Google review, which the details will be in that email. It goes a long way to all our staff who work extremely hard behind the scenes to make it all happen. And thank you for your time this evening for this webinar.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Good night.
Good night.